ministers of that church because he is a minister himself. And, when he saw all of those faces that were in the historical building, he had some concerns in terms of that being the face of gentrification in his mind because, he saw a lot of folks that probably back in the day would not have even been anywhere near that particular neighborhood, but now they are enjoying some nice houses, going to a church over there. Some of them are living far away from there. They might even be living around Duke or UNC's campus, but when it comes time for church, they are ready to come into the building that was a historical African-American building. So I do know that he had some concerns. Him and Aaron had a very deep conversation. I was sitting there listening to it in the middle of it, could understand both of their points to some degree, because Aaron, who is an African-American minister and part of the ministerial team for Christ Central, was letting Carl know that was not their intention, that they did not plan to buy the building, did not plan to take it over or anything of that nature. But, from an outside looking in, that's probably not what folks are thinking or seeing. So I can definitely understand both of their points of view and where they were coming from, but it was definitely interesting in hearing that conversation. And at the end, they did find some common ground. They are both ministers, so they did find some common ground, including both of them had lost parents in their lives, Aaron most recently and Carl not that long ago too. So they found some common ground just in their life story, and both are activists, so they did find some common ground. So like we were talking about with the conversation with the presidential candidates, anytime we can find common ground, that is a wonderful thing. So I was glad to see that they did not, in the end, while they probably agreed to disagree on some things, they did find some common ground as well.
Indeed, and we're going to bring that guest in 1 second, y'all. It's Straight Talk with Dina Mark.
Hi, we're the Goo Goo Dolls. We're fortunate that our daughters have what they need to grow and learn. But that isn't the case for nearly 13 million kids in the U.S. that struggle with hunger.
Childhood hunger is a heartbreaking reality that Feeding America is working to change. Each year, the Feeding America network of food banks rescues billions of pounds of good food that would have gone to waste and provides it to families and children in need.
You can help kids in need in your community by visiting feedingamerica.org.
Brought to you by Feeding America and the Ad Council.
All right, Dean.
We're back. Yeah.
Dean, before we get to the guests, I do want to get to the guests. I just want to clarify a little bit of the story about McDougal Terrace. Since we were talking about it, I do want to just wrap that up. It says at least 9 residents of Durham's McDougal Terrace public housing community have been taken to the hospital and treated for elevated levels of carbon monoxide, prompting officials on this past Friday, to go door-to-door checking for the potentially toxic gas. A woman was rushed to a local hospital for an evaluation after first responders found elevated levels of carbon monoxide in her unit in the complex, which is located at 1101 Lawson Street. The discovery has heightened fears at McDougal Terrace, where 344 apartments were checked for CO at the complex, which was first built in 1953. It is Durham's largest public housing community, according to the DHA, which is the Durham Housing Authority website, and it has been beset by poverty and violent crime in recent years. The issue came to light when EMS Assistant Chief for Clinical Affairs Lee Van Fleet noticed a call on December 23rd for carbon monoxide poisoning, the one confirmed case at the complex. Vet looked at the history of the calls for service for the month in that location and found that 7 other people were transported that month also had elevated levels of carbon monoxide in their system. So that's kind of where they went with that. And like I said, they have been doing some studies on some of the other complexes here in the area, and it looks like a lot of them are facing similar kind of issues as well. But that's just want to make a little bit of more details of that particular story. But let's get to our guests and see what they've got to talk about.
All right. Thank you for calling Straight Talk with Dina Mark. You are now on the line. Tell us who you are and where you're calling from.
Hello?
Hi there.
Hello.
This is Nicole Witt. Can you hear me?
We hear you.
Yes, we can.
Hi, this is Nicole Witt with the Adoption Consultancy.
How are you doing, Nicole?
I am doing great. How are you guys doing tonight?
Doing good. Tell us a little bit about your organization and what you're all about. Like I said, I've met so many great people in the community, and I know that we met and talked about you being on the show. So if you just share a little bit about what you do and what you're all about, we'll go from there, and then we'll just have like a conversation about adoption and things of that nature.
Sure. Yeah, I really appreciate you having me on. So going back several years, my husband and I went through the whole sort of infertility process, and we went through IVF and we went through donor egg, and I got very involved with the national chapter of the National Resolve, which is the support group for infertility. And as a result of all of those experiences, I started a local Resolve chapter, so it's basically a support group for people going through infertility. And I also ended up launching the adoption consultancy, which basically kind of helps. I hold people's hands throughout the adoption process because it is such an overwhelming and confusing process. So we sort of guide people step by step through the whole process, enabling them to adopt safely and quickly, and ideally with as little stress as possible.
And you said that the reason you got into adoption was because you and your husband were trying to have a baby and were not able to have the baby, so you decided to opt for the adoption route. I know a lot of friends of mine have had similar experiences, and they've sometimes gone and even adopted out of country, because I know one of my friends actually adopted some folks that were from Eastern Europe. I think I've known some folks that have adopted from other countries as well. What has been your experience just with the U.S. adoption? Because I know you just alluded to it a little bit, that sometimes folks are feeling that it's a little bit overwhelming to try to adopt in the U.S., and that's why they will sometimes go to a place like Eastern Europe or some of the other countries that might have a little looser regulations.
Well, right. So what happened actually with my husband and I is that we did not end up adopting. We ended up using an egg donor to have our children. And part of the reason we did that was because we believed so many of those myths that are out there about adoption, right? We believed that it takes years to adopt. We believed that the birth parents could come back, and reclaim their baby and things like that. So as I got involved with the infertility support group, I learned more and more about this, and I realized, wow, this is a really great option that people don't really know about. And that's kind of what led me to this path of educating people and helping them throughout this process. But these days, the international adoption landscape is so different than it used to be. So many of the really popular countries are closed to U.S. citizens adopting now. For instance, Guatemala is closed, and Russia is closed, and Vietnam is closed, and China has a very long wait time. So that those opportunities to adopt internationally just aren't as abundant as they used to be. So most people these days, when they really kind of learn about the myths versus the realities and the pros versus the cons, do end up pursuing domestic adoption.
And I'm imagining that more people are probably looking at adoption also because of the nature of society, because I know I've talked to friends of mine that are late life parents, and part of the reason they're late life parents is because they wanted to pursue their careers, they wanted to pursue being financially stable before getting married and or having kids. And so for that reason, some of them did not have their kids until they were well into their late 30s, early 40s. I would even say in some cases maybe even pushing near 50. I mean, I'm almost 60. That probably pushes the extreme of the element. So I don't know about that and everything. Sometimes that's one of my great regrets is I sit there going like, almost 57, be 58 in July, probably missed the baby window in terms of like having children and things of that nature. But then friends of mine, when I mention that to them, they're like, Mark, but you could be a mentor. You could have a kid that's a teenager that needs some sort of support in their life. So they're not ready to rule it out for me yet. I don't know if I'm ready to rule it out for myself. I have to give that some deep thought. But I do know that has been a conversation that I've had with different friends. But it does seem like it's a lot more popular for in vitro and other kinds of ways to have babies that are going to be safe if you're doing it at a later life because of the way society is.
Yeah, absolutely. You're totally right. I mean, the average age of marriage has increased. The average age where people start trying to have children has increased. And that's a big part of it, why you have so many more people who are experiencing infertility than, 10, 20, certainly 30 years ago. So a lot of those people do turn to fertility treatments, which may or may not be successful for them. Some people skip that part of the process and kind of jump right into adoption, whereas other people, they might spend years trying to, go through the fertility treatments, and if that doesn't work, then they end up adopting. So now they're even, that many years older. So I've definitely seen the average age of my clients, increase over the course of the last several years.
So that brings me to the question. I mean, like, what has been the youngest client you've had, and what's been the oldest client you've had, if you don't mind? I mean, without getting into their names or careers, but
right,
just in terms
right.
of like the age range, because getting names and careers, folks will figure out who they are. But just the average, the longest, the
right.
oldest age you've had, and the youngest age you've had.
Well, the youngest I've had was probably somewhere in their very early 20s, maybe 22, 23, something like that. And that was a couple who, they knew right away that they weren't going to be able to achieve a pregnancy. They didn't have to spend the time, going through the medical workups and the treatments and all that. Things had happened in their past where they already knew that was going to be the case. So as soon as they got married and wanted to start having a family, they kind of jumped right into adoption. The oldest, well, there's sort of two different sides to that coin. The oldest person that I've had adopt was, so he was the husband of a couple, but the wife was much younger. So he was actually in his early 70s and she was in her late 30s. So that was the oldest person who I've had adopt. But in terms of the couple, when they're more closer in age, I've had several couples in their early 50s and maybe one or two in their mid-50s who've successfully adopted.
Wow. So you have had some in the 50s that have done the whole adoption and everything. Now, you mentioned earlier some of the myths, and you alluded to some of them, and both the myths of adoption and the myths surrounding in vitro, because I know that there's a lot of people, when they think of in vitro, then they automatically go into the, for lack of a better term, the negative aspects of in vitro and some of kind of the genetic planning aspects of that. And that might be partly because I've been judging a festival that deals with science fiction and horror, so I've seen a couple of these films that deal with that bad side. But I was just wondering, so I know that's one of the myths that's out there, but explain to us some of the things that you've heard are myths in terms of both adoption and in vitro, because I imagine there's tons of myths that people have about both.
Yeah, well, I think you've hit on a big one for people who aren't, who haven't had to get medical assistance to have a family, or they hear about people who are doing that. And I think a lot of people do think, oh, they're interested, in the designer babies, right? They want to pick their different features and so on. And that just doesn't happen. I mean, people who are trying so desperately to just have a child, a healthy child, and to grow their family, they don't even want to specify gender, because then that's going to take away half of their opportunities right there. They're just happy to have a healthy and successful pregnancy. So, I think that's kind of a big myth, that people think that it's going to lead to, like I said, this focus on these designer babies. But I think another myth that's out there about in vitro is that I think people think that, okay, if you get to the point of IVF to try to build your family, well, then that works, and that's what happens. And I see so many people through the support group that I run that they expect that, okay, well, now I've gotten to this place, I understand that this is what I have to do to build my family, and then they're shocked when it doesn't work. And in vitro, of course, it depends so much on different factors and the age of the people involved and so on. But it only works in the ballpark of about a third of the time on average. So I think people think that, oh, well, once you get to that stage, that's going to work and that's how you're going to build your family. And that can be a very harsh reality for people who get there and have spent so much emotionally and financially to realize, the majority of the time this doesn't actually work. So I think that's an important myth to dispel before people make that decision about whether or not that's what they want to do. There are so many myths with adoption, and you're right, I did reference a couple of them. I think, the big one is that that it takes years and years and years, and it certainly doesn't need to. Again, it depends on so many different factors and how you approach it and so on. But almost all of our clients adopt within a year. Our average time frame is about 6 months, so it can certainly go much more quickly than people think. And the other thing is that it's legally very safe. That's one thing that so many people are terrified of when they consider adopting. They think that the birth parent